the Leventis Foundation and the Hellenic Observatory of the LSE researching the role of children and young people as political actors in light of their participation in climate action. He is the author of Disclosing Childhoods, Research and Knowledge and Production for Critical Childhood Studies from 2018, and co-editor of Reimagining Childhood Studies 2019, and Children and Borders 2014. He is also an associate editor of the Sage Encyclopedia of Children and Childhood Studies, co-editor of the journal Childhood by Sage, and co-editor of the book series Studies in Childhood and Youth by Palgrave. Together with Rachel Rosen and Sarada Balagopalan, Spyros is one of the conveners of the project Reimagining Childhood Studies, an ongoing collective project aimed at reimagining childhood studies as a field. Through a series of conversations aimed at reinvigorating debate within this multidisciplinary field, the project seeks to open it up to new ways of thinking and render it more inclusive, critical, and reflexive. And you can check their website address, which is reimaginingchildhoodstudies.com, that our team is going to post in the YouTube chat there for you to have. So without further ado, Spyros, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Andrea, for this very kind introduction. And thank you, Macarena, for inviting me, and the rest of the members of the organizing committee for inviting me to give a keynote today. Congratulations for putting together such an amazing event, bringing together so many people from so many different places and creating a sense of community despite the lack of physical contact. So congratulations. Now, when Macarena asked me to give this talk, I asked her to tell me a little bit about the audience. Since I'm an anthropologist, I'm not really working in the field of children's literature. So I wanted to, say something that would speak to the concerns of an audience like you. So she gave me some thoughts and I reflected on them, and I decided that it would be better if I share something more that had to do with my own concerns, my own anxieties with this field of childhood studies, my own frustrations, discomforts, but also the excitements that I have felt over the years, and try to see if there's something that could be shared along those lines. So my talk is going to revolve essentially around this key question of the field: what is a child? This fundamental ontological question that has preoccupied childhood studies for more than 3 decades now. So here it is. On Saturday, July 20th, 1974, I got up with my parents and my 2 sisters to the sound of sirens. My dad climbed up on the roof of the house and told us that he could see parachuters falling in the Mesauria Valley to the north of our house. Soon after, we heard very loud noises from military aircraft, and before we had time to realize what was happening, we felt a phantom aircraft passing over our house. As they were approaching, the sound was truly extraordinary and piercing. In retrospect, we found out that they were descending literally above our house to drop off their bombs in a Greek military camp less than a couple of kilometers away. Where I am speaking to you from now is very close to my parental home, so it's probably a couple of kilometers away from where I am right now. Now, the vibrations from the sound of the aircraft and the bombing caused many of the windows of our house to break. My dad shouted to all of us to get under the beds so as not to get hit by the shattered glass from the windows. And the bombing went on for a few minutes. When it stopped, we got in my father's van. We invited some of our neighbors who did not have a car so we could leave for a safer area. We did not take anything with us, and we drove through Nicosia. with the southern direction towards my grandparents' village, where it would be safer for us to be. I still vividly remember us driving through open fields, seeing and hearing the planes above us and wondering if they would bomb us at any moment. I also remember us stopping on the way to pick up an injured, bleeding man and giving him a ride too. And years later, when I discussed this incident with my parents, they told me that he was a political prisoner who escaped that day after he was injured. Now, you might wonder, of course, why I started with this very personal note. After all, this is a conference on children's literature. And it is certainly not an attempt on my part to highlight the extraordinary of my life, not is it an attempt to suggest that I myself had any special role to play in all this? It was, I was literally thrown into this history like so many children of my generation in Cyprus. But because our histories do matter in how we pursue knowledge, how we talk about others, including children, I think it is important to be aware, if nothing else, about our constitutive role in producing knowledge. Now, it will take a long time for me to offer you the necessary context, historical context that is, that would allow you to make sense of what happened. But let me just say that on July 20th, the day I just described to you, following a coup d'etat, a few days earlier, on July 15th, 1974, Turkey invaded Cyprus and occupied about 37% of its territory, resulting in thousands of refugees, both Greek Cypriot and Turkish Cypriot, and leading to the de facto separation of Cyprus. The two major communities of the island have lived apart since then, with Greek Cypriots living in the north, in the south, and Turkish Cypriots living in the north. And I'll show you a drawing made by one of the children in a research project I was involved with, which shows you how the island is split. The red part is the north occupied part. I live very close to the border in the southern part of the island. But let me go back to state more clearly what I think we may take from this personal reference, at least as it relates to this fundamental question we started with, which is, what is a child? My first point will be that the child, as a particular type of being, is not reducible to any particular understanding. To suggest otherwise would be to ignore its highly variable and malleable constitution across time and space, but also, and relatedly, its experiential character, which gives it meaning and form. The sense of shock and fear I felt during those days of the war, I was 8 years old at the time. I will spare you the calculation, I'm 55 now. As well as the experience of being in a war in all its intensity and uncertainty, running away to save our lives, nothing of which is heroic, of course, because it just happens and you find yourself in it. All of this constituted me in a particular and unique way. I would suggest that you cannot make sense of who I am as a scholar without account of this pastness and my experience of growing up in a divided country. Needless to say, this might not always be the case for everyone, but it is rarely absent as a subtext of who we are and what we do with knowledge. It's always there and does impact to some extent what we end up pursuing. So it is in this sense that I refer to the irreducible child in the title of this talk. We can begin to understand children in all their variability and complexity only when we put aside our preconceptions about what children are and might be and move to a more generative space where we try to understand how children are constituted and how childhood is done. The childhood experiences I described to you are, of course, highly particular and can only be made sense of from within a particular historical, cultural, and social context, to say the least. They escape, in other words, the all too easy attributions of what childhood entails or what a child is and could be. And this is because there is sorry. There we go. And this is because there is both a material reality, there are bodies involved, material conditions of life, and so on and so forth, but also a set of discursive forces which frame that material reality and which cannot be left out of the equation. It is neither nor, it is both at one and the same time. And to account for them together without reducing one to the other or simply to add one to the other is important, although admittedly difficult to do. To some extent, of course, there might be forces at work which create particular intensities, the traditional sociological categories, race, ethnicity, gender, age, etc., etc. But life often tends to be quite more complex, making it hard to reduce us to mere labels. That was my first point. My second point is that all of us adults, including those of us who are involved with the scholarly study of childhood, carry memories of our childhood, good and bad, ordinary and extraordinary, which shape what we do, impact our choices and preferences, as well as our sensitivities and sensibilities, sometimes in small ways, at other times in bigger ways, sometimes consciously, sometimes unconsciously. Who we are carries with it a sense of ethics and politics that is not outside knowledge production, but is integral to all efforts to make sense of the world. I will return to this point later on because I think it's important to make these linkages. They point not just to a need for a critically reflexive attitude towards knowledge production, but also to a sense of responsibility which should come with the privilege of producing knowledge. When years later I would go on to pursue a PhD in anthropology, the experiences I talked to you about did impact on my choice of topic. My doctoral dissertation explored Greek Cypriot children's constructions of national identities. Given my own childhood experiences, I wanted to make sense of how growing up in a divided country impacts one's sense of being. What kind of person comes out of a child who grows up in a divided country and in such a highly politicized context? I had come to see the destructive consequences of nationalism in my country, which led to its division. And I wanted to contribute in however small a way towards a better understanding of the forces that give rise to such negative outcomes. My ethics and politics clearly played a role in choosing to pursue this project. In the mid-90s, when I was carrying out my PhD research, it was, you could say, the beginning of childhood studies as an interdisciplinary field. It was a very exciting time because now it was possible to talk about children as social actors and social agents. They were not to be seen as passive and naive about the world, but as competent and insightful social actors who had much to tell us about their own lives and worlds. To me, as a young and new scholar, this was very exciting. Most of the earlier work I read treated children as more or less passive, at the mercy of powerful socialization processes which determined what kind of persons they would end up being. Considering that this was not necessarily the case was fascinating because it allowed me to think of children as subjects in their own right and pursue research with them as knowledgeable social actors. So I pursued this theoretical angle, documenting the many ways in which the children I studied acted upon the world, made sense of it, reproduced and produced it through their own active involvement and participation. I wanted to humanize children, in a sense, by showing that they were not different from adults in their ability to act on and operate in the world. I tried to be as sensitive to the social, cultural, and historical context I was working in, taking into account the connections and the relationalities which emerged in the flow of everyday life. But I did end up in many ways with the agentic monadic child. It was a child to be understood, celebrated, highlighted. He, she was a newfound hero and heroine. And it was not just me, of course. Hundreds of other scholars, childhood scholars, went about answering that fundamental question of the field, what is a child, in similar ways across different empirical contexts. The evidence was there. The children I was studying were clearly acting on the world. They were in all respects social actors and sometimes social agents who managed to transform their worlds. On occasion, they resisted official discourses, reacted towards teachers, and challenged nationalist ideologies, drawing on their own experiences and alternative understandings rooted in their own knowledge of the world. But they were also squarely rooted in history, within history, and faced powerful constraints, both material and discursive, in how they lived and reflected on their lives, their past, present, and future. They were crafting the world alongside adults, but not on equal terms. Their power and ability was very much limited compared to the power of adults, and not always in desirable and ethically good ways. For instance, in the context of this early study, I tried to understand how children construct their national identities both within and outside of school, given the highly politicized context in which they grew up. It became clear that the school played a key role in creating an us versus them framework on which children build their national identities. We, Greeks or Greek Cypriots, are good. They, Turks or Turkish Cypriots, are bad. We are civilized. They are uncivilized. Many of the children ended up reproducing stereotypes about the other, the Turks, which left little room for cultivating understanding, reconciliation, and peace. In the classroom context, they often talked about the Turks in negative terms, as barbarians, bad, egoists, terrorists, torturers, warmongers, quarrelsome, and the list goes on. Their identities as children, and their national identities in particular, were rooted in the violent past of their country, which could be neither easily forgotten nor ignored, even though they themselves were born after 1974 and never experienced the war. In that sense, it was not enough to assert their agency, which was there. It was also important to ask what kind of agency is that? To what extent it was productive or reproductive of dominant discourses? This is a drawing by an 11-year-old girl whose house was right next to the buffer zone, or the green line, as is known in Cyprus, which divides the island into two. You saw it earlier in the map that I showed you. Not far again from where I sit, the dividing line runs close to 200 kilometers across the island. One of my field sites was a community of mostly refugee families who lived in Nicosia right next to the dividing line. When I asked this girl to explain her drawing, she told me that she drew a Turk, which she labeled in Greek as such at the top of the drawing, you can see. She also drew a Cypriot, she said, with a dividing line in the middle to show that they are different and separated. When I asked her to tell me something more about the drawing, she acted surprised and said, "Don't you see? I drew an abnormal Turk. One of his legs is shorter, and he only has hair on half of his head. He's abnormal." And she proceeded to contrast him with a Cypriot girl who she considered to be normal. It's interesting here if you have like, a gender lens to see that the other is masculine, the self is feminine. The other is an aggressor in this case. And so he takes a masculine form. And she proceeded to contrast him with a Cypriot girl who she considered to be normal. So in many ways, she was reproducing what she learned at school about the evil Turks who invaded the unoccupied Cyprus and the good us who were the victims of Turkish aggression. Yet this was not the whole story. As I later found out during the summer, before she drew this for me, the Turkish guards who were guarding at a post a few meters away from her house threw rocks and broke the window of her bedroom. She was terrified, and her parents had her leave the house and stay with her grandparents, who lived at the suburb of Nicosia, far from the buffer zone. So her anger and clear, somehow I touch the screen and it proceeds to the next slide. Her anger and clear hatred for the Turks was rooted in many ways in her experience of what happened to her, on the emotional reaction which the incident I described gave rise to, as well as all the discourses that she was exposed to at home, at school, and beyond. So one may see her agency at work here, stemming from her direct experience, yet still being within the limits of the discursive and material worlds she's operating within. the kind of learning she had, where she lives. She lives right next to the border, so that's very hard to avoid in terms of your understanding of the world. In other words, we need to make sense of her and her agency and the limits of her agency by locating her within the complex set of forces that constitute her, some of which create a certain kind of stickiness and put multiple constraints on her. So along the way, I learned that the constitution of the child entails a very complex process which cannot be understood or theorized in neat ways. It is a messy process which requires that we respect this messiness. Children were agents, but not free-willing agents. They were highly constrained and limited, yet they were neither passive nor naive. They could think and reflect about their worlds and act on them, even if not always in desirable ways. Most importantly, what I learned from this early substantial piece of research with children was that childhood research is foremost about children. It is important to close in on children, to acknowledge them, to talk to them, to listen to them, to observe them, to bring their voices and worlds forth and make them visible, to use, in other words, a child-centered approach to research. There is clearly value in considering children's standpoints and accounting for their unique positioning in the generational social order. I use participatory approaches in my research with children, for instance, to help me move away from my research on children to research with children, which was important in many respects because it helped me acknowledge both the epistemic value of knowledge produced through children's participation, which is clearly different from knowledge produced when children are treated as objects of study, as well as the ethical value of including their ways of being, their voices and perspectives in the knowledge produced. To put it another way, what I learned from children about children, I could have never learned from adults. And this was indeed huge for me and still remains a powerful insight into knowledge production. Through this early work of mine, I also became keenly aware of the role of power in research, and especially how the adult researcher role plays out in relation to children. I tried to be as inclusive as I could and critical and reflexive about my own positionality, but of course there was no way around power. It had to be accounted for, and here I do not mean in a simplistic and naive manner. It was not the simplified formula, adult equals powerful, child equals powerless, which is often assumed in the research encounters. Power was everywhere. And yes, I had to account for my own privilege and position, but I also had to account for those cases when children had the upper hand, when they could exercise their own power on me and the research process. This reflexive realization of the workings of power has sensitized me about the need to attend to my own knowledge practices. I have written about this in a recent book publication, arguing that unless we do this, that is, to become keenly aware of how our own choices, both theoretical and methodological, impact the kinds of knowledge we produce about children and childhood, we cannot claim to be reflexive. As researchers, we have choices, and every choice we exercise can have effects on the knowledge we produce. Which children do we include, for instance? Which do we leave out? What do we consider data, and what do we dismiss as non-data? Is silence, for instance, data, or can it be safely ignored and left out since it does not normally make it into our transcripts? What about the inconsistencies, the discrepancies, the messy and confusing data we gather? How do we treat them? Do we treat them at all? To go back to the role that power plays in this, in the child-adult relationalities, it was gradually becoming clear to me that things were more complex, more dynamic, more relational than the field had initially proclaimed. So when years later, after completing my PhD and returning to Cyprus from the US, the Turkish Cypriot leadership decided one day of 2003 to open the checkpoints and allow people to cross over to the other side of the island. I was there on that first day, crossing for the first time after almost 3 decades to the other half of my country, a highly emotional, moving experience that I will not be able to convey to you in any meaningful way here. Nevertheless, this further sparked my interest in children's political lives. And I decided to pursue a new project with some colleagues on children's border crossing experiences. These will be children who either belong to refugee families, that is, children whose parents and grandparents fled the north in 1974, or children who are not refugees but had now the opportunity to cross over to the north and visit the occupied part of Cyprus. Now, there was a glimpse of hope that this generation of children who could now encounter the other, the Turks and the Turkish Cypriots, by crossing over would constitute itself and the other in different ways, perhaps more hopeful ways that would circumvent the oppositional thinking of the past, the us versus them way of thinking I described to you earlier, and which shaped their worldviews and visions of the future. How would a generation of children who were born and grew up in a divided country and who had never visited the other half of their country react to the opportunity to cross over? So in this project, we tried to understand how these children experience border crossing. And here is an example from a reaction from a child who is describing the experience of crossing at a checkpoint. There are checkpoints across the buffer zone that allow you to go to the other side. And she says, I feel, let's say, that something might happen, something might go wrong. They might see that we're Greek Cypriots and something might happen. I'm a bit scared sometimes, but okay, it's not always. Sometimes I also feel great. Okay, the policemen are there and I always feel a bit weird because the policemen and the Turkish Cypriots are there and they're checking passports and car licenses. Okay, until we go through, I feel a bit there. I always feel a bit weird, but okay, after I cross, I feel better. I'm a bit more comfortable. So from this brief excerpt here, you can get a sense of the fear that is felt, the anxiety, but it is fear and anxiety which has to be placed within the discursive reality of the division and the material reality of crossing actual territory, especially on those early days of the opening of the checkpoints. So by now, and in the process of reflecting on the data we generated in this project, I was beginning to recognize the radical interdependencies of children's lives, which can help us move somewhat beyond the monadic, agentic child who thinks and acts from a unitary position. They were actors for sure, but what kind of actors? Their ability to act on the world was predicated on other forces and agents. It was not just them as children, it was also adults, their parents and grandparents with whom they often crossed, their teachers whose opinions informed their sense of national identity. It was the media which framed the island's division and occupation in particular ways. It was the materiality of the checkpoint through which they had to cross, the symbolism, the flags, and so on. And which engendered multiple emotions, including the anxiety and fear that we've seen in the excerpt above. It was the long-lost homes of their parents and grandparents, which they got to visit in the north, and so on and so forth. The kind of child which was constituted during these border crossing experiences was not a pre-given, but an outcome of the coming together of multiple forces and agencies, both human and non-human, both material and discursive. The child which emerged in these instances was neither totally predictable nor totally unpredictable. More importantly, her agency was distributed. It was an outcome of her engagement with others, with the material and discursive world she operated in not an autonomous possession which she carried with her. Childhood studies scholars have been commenting on this in recent years. My reading of new materialist scholarship certainly impacted my understanding of what I was able to see, what I was able to understand and disclose in my research. This kind of thinking allowed me to go back to the fundamental question of the field and to once again ask, what is a child? And to reflect on how best to go about answering that question. Not that there is an answer, but at least thinking about it. Relational thinking and relational ontologies offered me a productive way forward. They allowed me to focus not on the individual child, but on the relations which constitute her. Other keynote presentations have addressed some of these aspects that I'm referring to here. It allowed me to explore how children are made and how childhood is done relationally out of the assembled relations between children and others, humans and non-humans, materialities and discourses. So once again, any preconceived notions of what a child is had to be unsettled and rethought. There was no child there to find, but forces to take into account in understanding what the child is, what the child may be. This was no liberty to throw away categories and labels which exist and do matter, and they are themselves also constituted of the child. So I'm not suggesting we throw away the category childhood or the label child. Rather, it was a realization that there was no stable ontology of the subject that would help us make sense of the child, but rather a multiplicity of agents and forces that would have to be accounted for. It was also a realization on my part that I, as a researcher, was also implicated in ontologizing this child. Not out of thin air, of course, but still I had the power to disclose a child that my choices, theoretical, methodological, political, and ethical, allowed me. So when in 2019, children and young people in Cyprus started mobilizing around the cause of climate change, inspired by the International Fridays for Future movement and Greta Thunberg in particular, I was again drawn into this question: what is a child? And the related question of children's political subjectivities, except that this time the discourse was much more expansive, touching global existential proportions, and not the more narrow one defined by nationalist loyalties, which I pursued earlier. This new and still current preoccupation of mine stems from my own concern with rethinking the temporalities of childhood, and foremost among them, the future. It also stems from my desire to see childhood studies exploring alternatives, experimenting, and finding new, more ethically and politically productive avenues for knowledge production. So the question again surfaces: how can we respond meaningfully in childhood studies to the question, what is a child, given children's unprecedented mobilization around climate action and their political positioning in relation to the future that we've seen? In a recent editorial of Childhood, I take up this issue and reflect on the opportunities for re-engaging with the notion of the future as a field, focusing on what it means to consider children as future makers. What I mean with children as future makers is that children are willing and ready to work towards crafting more desirable futures for themselves as well as for others. In the ethnographic project with young climate activists in Cyprus, we try to look more closely at how young climate activists engage with the future as an orientation. I will try to offer you here a glimpse again into the kind of engagement that they have with the future. I apologize that I don't give you the full context of these projects, but my aim is more to highlight this evolving sense of what a child is, for me at least. For many young climate activists, for example, the future appears quite scary, even if they recognize that the world is gradually waking up to the unfolding crisis. Here's a quote from one of our participants. I'll say that the climate crisis will get more attention, but the way to achieve that will be very painful because many people and many animals will suffer. There will be more investment. The green industry could be a very profitable industry, but it will be done very, very late. It will be too late to save anything. Many people will die. Many animals will die. Many countries will disappear. It's not that we lost the battle. We can still work towards a better future, but it's already late. We have this 40-year time lapse, and the future is very, very scary for me. The unpredictability of climate further compounds the uncertainty and anxiety with which many young climate activists see the future. It is a future which, after all, might not be there, as Pandora, the girl who shared that with us, explained to us. She said, we are taught to dream big and plan for the future, but if we have no future, what should we plan for? At the same time, and despite the sometimes apocalyptic futures they imagine, young climate activists desire a world which will be more hospitable, more sustainable, but fear that it might not be possible. Some of them made it a point to tell us how on some days they are optimistic because they heard something positive about the environment, while on other days they're pessimistic because they're confronted with the extent of the problem and the limited effort that goes into addressing it, especially by governments. In our discussions, they talked about the future they would like to see as one without wars, exploitation, discrimination, and social inequalities, where people have equal opportunities to live and flourish. For many of them, hope is a fundamental prerequisite for their activism. However, their sense of hope comes when they realize that they are part of something bigger than themselves, that they are part of a social movement with a vision for a different, more just and sustainable future, when they come to see themselves as future makers, whose activism and protesting in the streets is having an impact in society and whose actions can no longer be ignored by adults. What we see here is another kind of child who seeks to ontologize himself in more relational terms. A child who is connected with and cares about this wider world, including the non-human world. It is a child who is ready and willing to reassert its ontological status and to redefine her position in the generational order, to declare her political presence in a world which mostly deprives her of formal political participation. But it would be naive to also ignore the all-too-powerful neoliberal logic in which these same children grow, and which is a logic that celebrates the individual and cultivates narcissism. Social media being an outstanding example of how that is done, though I don't mean to say that social media only do that. So it is not that today's children have figured it out and they are on their way to finding truth. The future is still an open question. Now, our challenge as scholars is to disclose these emerging ontologies of the child in all their complexity and variability, and to theorize this relationality without reducing once again the child to a mere identity. This work with young climate activists has helped me to grapple with the idea of the future in childhood studies and to see how the future can become a tool for comprehending children's and young people's lives in the present and their emerging sense of political subjectivity, informed by all the complexity that characterizes that which is yet to be. There is an opportunity now beyond conceptualizations of children as future adults and beyond adultist visions of futures for children to explore new alternative possibilities for the future with children. What kind of child emerges out of the future-oriented trajectories we witness today with children? At a time when children and young people are actively pursuing their right to shape their futures rather than let adults to do so on their behalf, and pursuing a politics of hope, seeking to reclaim the future, our challenge as childhood studies scholars, or whichever field you are part of, is to engage with this political moment in the world's history and to do what we do best, which is to contribute towards critiquing, clarifying, and understanding it, while also facilitating it, especially by disclosing the new imagined worlds of children, when and where our ethical and moral imperatives oblige us to do so. Needless to say that children sometimes go the wrong way. I mean, you have participation in neo-Nazi groups today, so it's not always that noble, but I'm mostly referring to that positive manifestation of their activism. Okay, now that I gave you a sense of what has preoccupied me, at least to some extent, in my own work, I want to return to that assertion I make in the title of the talk, that the child is irreducible. I hope to have shown through my own personal trajectory as a childhood studies scholar that it is productive to retain a degree of discomfort when it comes to the very object of our inquiry, namely the child. Discovering a particular ontology of the child, such as the monadic agentic child of the early childhood studies, can be exciting and productive in so many different ways, but it should not mean the end of our inquiry. The child is not a set of attributes, but an assemblage of forces which can be assembled and reassembled, sometimes with greater and sometimes with lesser ease. Neither should our current theoretical concerns foreclose more critical engagement with that question. If our aim is to understand children, we need to move more decidedly towards decentering the child and to embrace the relationalities, collective connectivities, and linkages which render her possible. Embracing this relationality of the child as both a material reality and discursive construct at one and the same time allows us to engage squarely with the ontoepistemological dimension of knowledge production in ways that overcome the unproductive dualisms of the past: nature, culture, subject, object, matter, discourse, even child, adult. I wrote about the notion of the irreducible child briefly in my book, Disclosing Childhoods, that Andrea mentioned, where I argue that we need to reimagine the child in ways that avoid closure and leave the child question open. My aim was to show that the tendency to explain away the child, to reduce her to a set of capacities, might contribute more towards caricaturing the child rather than elucidating her. Relational ontologists alert us about the irreducibility of the child, and that any agential cat, it's a kind of funky term, but it's important in its own way, we can discuss it later, we enact on the world is precisely that, a cat in an entangled world in order to delineate particular categories and understandings which speak not for what the child is, but how she comes into being in time and space, exhibiting particular capacities which could be otherwise within another set of assembled relations. Of course, I don't want to mean that the child is a composite of different things and there's nothing that makes that child unique. That's not my point, but rather is to suggest that she can be constituted and reconstituted through diverse assembled relations. There are, in other words, multiple ontologies of the child, not just epistemological renditions of the child, which can be enacted through research, acknowledging the ontological irreducibility of the child and the partiality, situatedness, and limits of knowing, as well as the politics of representation, which produce certain understandings of children rather than others, is an ethical imperative because it refuses to eliminate the mess and dynamism which characterizes the constitution of the child. So to conclude, I try to show through my own personal journey in childhood studies some of the things I learned along the way and some of the things I didn't learn, which might be worth sharing with others. First, something happened to the screen. The screen disappeared.
We see your screen, we see your PowerPoint.
Okay, disappeared from my computer. Okay. No problem. So there's the things that I think we can share. First, our own childhoods, our histories, who we are, in other words, are often constitutive of the disclosures we engage in. We're not detached observers of children's worlds, but engaged scholars who have preferences, positions, and ways of seeing. Moreover, what we disclose about children's worlds has ethical and political implications, and we need to reflect on those as well, whether we acknowledge it or not, they're there. Second, and relatedly, the knowledge we produce through our work is an enactment. It is not a fabrication, at least in the majority of cases. I mean, you can imagine, somebody actually fabricating that, but usually that's not the case. So it's not a fabrication, but a disclosure, which is always situated and partial. As an enactment or disclosure, that's the word that I prefer to use. This knowledge is the outcome of an agential cadescet, which brings forth a particular ontology, a particular angle that we, through which we slice, that understanding we have of the child. Therefore, there is always something else, always something more, always something different, which could come forth or will come forth at some point. Ontologies are multiple in that sense. The real multiplies through our knowledge practices, and we are a constitutive element in this process of multiplying. Third, children's worlds, like adults' worlds, are relational, interdependent, and messy. Children are constituted out of diverse assemblages of materials, discourses, technologies. And because these are assemblages, they're never entirely stable, though they can also be sticky and highly constraining at times. The structural realities of children's lives, though I do realize that this is not the proper framing here for those who adhere to assemblage theory, they don't like the word structure, are very real and cannot and should not be dismissed, whatever you want to call them, stickiness or whatever. Emergence and fluidity should not blind us to the harsh realities of existence, racism, sexism, and so on. Being critically mindful of the child who is not this or that, but irreducible, reminds us that it is indeed important to produce knowledge which is informed and persuasive, but not arrogant. At a time when multiple crises confront our future as a species, the position from which we stand as childhood scholars, trying to do our part in creating prospects for a better world, it is crucial to seek out and make visible, to disclose, as I said, is my preferred word, new possibilities for counter-hegemonic renderings of what a child is and can be in a neoliberal world which seeks to foreclose more ethical and just alternatives. We are all immersed, perhaps to different degrees, but still immersed in a globalized culture of narcissism, where we are asked to compete, stand out, and win. It is certainly not easy to create alternative possibilities, alternative logics for the future, but precisely because the model of the one world fits all does not and should not be allowed to wipe out all hope in creating these more ethical and just alternative worlds where children should have a key role in crafting, not just as adults. It is important that we also do our part to produce the kind of scholarship which highlights our deeply interdependent and, to use the word of the conference, entangled worlds, which need to remain open and hopeful. In many ways, children today seem to be at the forefront of rethinking the world and challenging us adults to take responsibility with them. They're inviting us, actually, in how we proceed. Along the way, they're also having us move away from our preconceptions. Refusing to reduce the child to a category or type can potentially be our own contribution towards disclosing worlds where children are or might be otherwise contributing in this way to a global dialogue on how to imagine other ways of being and living. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Spyros, so much. Thank you so much for that. I am sure that if we were in an actual conference room with real people, you would be hearing a round of applause, and
I feel it.
don't know how to get that towards you. To the audience, I will say now that please remember that you can post your questions on the YouTube chat in English or in Spanish, and our backstage team will help merge those questions and make them succinct so that I can pass them through to Spyro. I have one question while the audience is warming up. So once again, thank you. And thank you for sharing these like personal experience and reflective trajectories and insisting like through your own practice on all of us researchers here in this room, researchers in one way or another, to not be arrogant, to be open-minded adults, as someone said in a previous talk, and inviting us to this critical reflexiveness. I think that though your talk was very neatly organized, I believe there is far more messiness in what you are saying. There are layers of concepts, ideas, and practices that overlap and entangle. And it is messy to research with children, and sometimes we avoid it because of the messiness. And of course, the climate crisis foreshadows much more messiness there. You mentioned this in your talk, you titled the editorial in Childhood as Children as Future Makers. And yet, despite the disclosure of child, and maybe I would invite you to elaborate a little bit more on the term, what you're thinking when you're saying disclosure. So I'm saying, despite the disclosure of child as present agent humans from the field of childhood studies, these ideas entangle with the ideological view of children as future adults in the making, which is a form of, I think, of onto-epistemologic injustice in itself. And I am having some trouble there wrapping my head around the idea that as researchers, we seem to be, and I think we genuinely believe, we're also being future makers with our research. How do you see research as future making too? Could you maybe give us some, I think you did give us some hints on that, but maybe emphasize that idea. Thank you.
Okay, I mean, that's a fair question. I mean, at one level, we do not need to do away with the mess. The mess should not scare us. I mean, I'm an anthropologist, and the mess that I discover when I work with children is inviting me to reflect more on what that fundamental question of what is a child means for my work. So at that fundamental level, I think it's inviting us that recognition that the world is quite complex and that we cannot kind of summarize in a few words what the child is in many ways liberating and allows us to imagine a field of studies that continues to be critical and open to new ways of thinking. But at another level, it also invites us to think of other ways in which we can reflect on the category and the notion of the future maker, however difficult it is to explore the future through the present, is an inviting notion. The notion of the future maker suggests that children at this particular historical point are actually willing to consider themselves as able and willing to make a change. Contrary to all the stereotypes, we read about children's political apathy, they're not interested in elections and so on, and that's probably true. I mean, the numbers seem to be going down in terms of young people's participation in elections, but yet we see a rise in these more informal ways of children's participation in politics through social movements, initiatives that they believe in, and they work towards. The climate change mobilizations are probably our best, most recent example, but you had other examples in South America, the case of working children, the Nuts. You have the gun control movements in the US. So children are there and are asserting their right to craft other kinds of future. So I think this tension that we see children experiencing, and if you recall some of the quotes that I put up for you, being scared, being anxious, yet being hopeful at the same time, is a depiction of that tension that we're all experiencing in the world today. So our role, I mean, if we have a role in all this, I think we do. It's perhaps not a grand role in the sense that we cannot change the world through scholarship. I mean, we, contribute in a small way, but to the extent that we do contribute something is, I think, in terms of disclosing these worlds. Now, to focus on the future means that you actually bring forth all the possibilities that children imagine for themselves. And by making it public, by making it open, opening it up for discussion, you are also contributing towards making private anxieties, tensions into public issues. So that in itself is a contribution, whether you do that through literary texts or through ethnographic accounts or simply by publishing articles which are academic and impact a much smaller group of people. I think there is value to making the future visible in terms of its manifestations. And opening up the space for discussion with children who are often excluded from these debates. So the notion of the child as a future adult you're absolutely right, is a form of injustice. It's a form of injustice because we're depriving the child of the right to participate in the present, of the right to craft that future that at the end of the day, they are more likely to experience than our generation.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. I have two questions here, and I have the feeling that you have already sort of like touched on them, but I am going to read them to you just to render and recognize the audience and thank them for writing their questions in here. There's one question from Carolina Szymborska, and she says, thank you. And I'd like to ask you about the revival of futurity. Do you see this topic appearing also in newspapers and child-authored literature? How this relation can translate into education? I'd be grateful for your comments. And I have another question. Maybe I will ask both. I will make both comments right away. There's a comment from Lorena Leiva, and she is touching on the current situation we're living now in Chile. We're writing a new constitution because the youth decided to jump and subvert the politics of the fare price of the metro, the metro fare, the subway. So Lorena says we are at a historical time in Chile where children make us move forward or move the borders. So her question is, what would be the role of the adults in this context? And I'm guessing it's more like, how do we contribute or participate in that process?
Okay, I mean, maybe we can combine the two questions together. I mean, there's clearly a value to opening up discussions about the future. I mean, the sense, Henry Giroux has this, analysis of hope and agency, and he says that, you need some basic hope in order to be able to act, and the more you act, the more hope you gain, which allows you in turn to, hope more. And it's kind of a circular and dynamic process through which hope and agency work. So opening up a discussion about the future precisely does that, I think, and that's why I think it's important. It creates the conditions for thinking and acting rather than simply accepting that the future is inevitable. I mean, in South America, you do have many initiatives that are happening to allow for a pluriverse, for multiple worlds, and not just the one world model. In Africa, you have other initiatives. In Europe, you have, even by young people, initiatives that try to rethink the future, not as one possibility, but rather as many possibilities. So people who do not want to live their lives immersed in self-centeredness, but want to experience life in a more relational way, should have that opportunity. And young people today are asserting this right to claim these alternative worlds. So whether it's done through education, through literature, through research and what we do, I think it's all good, because it's opening up the question of what other ways of being, of living, of thinking, of feeling, of acting on this world could we imagine, and how could some of these worlds materialize. So ultimately, I think it's a good prospect, and we have a role as scholars to facilitate these kinds of discussions. The second question, again, touches on the question of intergenerational collaboration, which I think we need to work on. And this is so badly needed, because there is putative opposition between generations and a generation gap, But the positive note is that young people are actually reaching out to older people, to older generations, and extending a hand of solidarity. So I think the least we can do is reciprocate and engage in that kind of intergenerational dialogue. It doesn't mean that young people will do what they want and we won't do what we want. It's a dialogue, and it's a public dialogue which needs to happen. But the crisis that we're faced with, the human crisis we're faced with, cannot be resolved simply by young people or old people or politicians. They require a much more elaborate set of collaborations. And I think, this is a historical time that we need to respond to, everyone from their own position and their own, angle.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. Yeah, we have a couple of more questions here. And you have talked about the distributed agency and all this relationality. Macarena Garcia is asking, how can we press us to think more about what is or does an adult and what is or does a researcher in our exploration of what is or does a child? It's almost like a pun, a riddle here, but it's back and forth relationship, right? And we are adults, we're researchers, there's a child who's also producing knowledge.
Yeah. The relationalities are important to account for because, as I try to kind of explain in my talk, this is what constitutes everyone. We don't exist beyond our relations. You could carry that to, in a bit more extreme way and claim that we're nothing except for our relations. And so, thinking about the relationalities between children and adults is important because there are clearly power differences. But these are not, as I said, naive power differences. It's not that adults have all the power and children have no power. If politics and the politics of social movements are an indication, they suggest that perhaps adults don't have all the power, and children's ability and capacity to exercise political power is enormous. It's underutilized. It hasn't been expressed sufficiently, but it's there. So it could reconstitute politics as we know it if things, move that way, and these multiple crises we talked about create even more tension. Then we probably will see a new kind of politics in which children play and young people play a much more decisive role in what comes next. So bearing in mind that, yes, there are categories, adults, children, and they do have power because they define us in so many ways. You're a child until you're 18 and you cannot do X, Y, and Z. And all of a sudden, the next day you become an adult and you have all these other different rights. There are multiple definitional and categorical constraints imposed on this category. So we need to take them into account, even when we profess, like I do, that this should not limit our understanding of what an adult and what a child is. In the research context, I increasingly find it that we need to humanize and democratize the interaction more. Very often we come from an angle which is extractivist. As adults, we want to get information, data, gather excerpts and this and that from children to serve our purposes. And we don't engage enough in honest discussions with them. In the context of this project I was referring to you earlier, I came to realize that the traditional kind of interview is not a good way to communicate with these young people. They wanted to know what we thought. they wanted our opinions. They wanted to see how we're politically positioned in relation to their cause. So it's not a case anymore that we can, make the assumption that, we are researchers, they are children, subjects that we need to get data and information from. But in this highly politicized context of the 21st century and social movements, we need to rethink also our ways of relating with our subjects, quote unquote.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. There is a question here from Nivedita Subramanian. And I think it relates to this last thing that you were saying. She says, you raised some really important questions during your talk, the need to think about what gets categorized as data, how does one include or account for silence in a transcript, and so on. Could you give us some insights on how you have faced challenges like these?
Okay, I've written a little bit about voice and silence in my work. I can send you, the references if you want to read what I wrote a few years ago about these issues. But yes, I do strongly believe that, what we leave out very often is very significant, and sometimes even more significant than what we include in the kind of work we do. So I'm very mindful about the absences in the kinds of work we engage in, especially with children. As you might know, childhood studies kind of valorize children's voices, paying a lot of attention to what children say, extracting codes the way I did today to illustrate things. We do this and we're very fond of it because we feel like, we are communicating something authentic and genuine about children's words, but this has its limits, and we need to be careful about how we reify the categories and the people that we're trying to understand. So silence, for instance, is very often expressed as an absence, as something which is not said, as something which is not vocalized. So to account for silence is not easy. It's not easy because, you work with a transcript, and now you have data processing software and Atlas and Vivo and all this, and you put your, material and then you try to analyze it, qualitative, for a qualitative study. But what is not there is left out. And my point would be that, all these absences can be critical, and we want to account for them, and we need to develop methodologies that allow us to do that in a more sensitive way, So a pause in a conversation with a child could signify something extremely important. So it's not just that you put 3 dots in the transcript, there might be a lot more there. But this kind of work is also not conducive to the new logic of publishing and, producing countless articles and, chapters and all these things, because it takes time. To account for somebody's complexity, it takes time. So in that sense, it's not the kind of research that we see often so carefully done to account also not just for the presences, but the absences. And but I think ethically, it's the kind of research that has value. And even if it doesn't happen all the time, when it does happen, it just shows us that we need to be mindful of the depth in a child's world or a group's world. That would be a methodological kind of sensitivity that we need to develop, I think.
Yeah, thank you. I think we have time for one last question. So I'm going to read. It's a question, and I think it takes us again to that maybe ethical idea and this continuum, like in this process here. It's from Lorraine Kerslake, and she says, thank you for such an important talk. I agree that we all need to learn from children and that they are the most vulnerable in times of climate change. Hope is a really important element which needs promoting, although perhaps more with adults than children. But isn't it kind of ironic that we need to learn from children when we should be teaching them the path for the future?
That's a good question. I don't think it's ironic. I think, learning goes both ways. I mean, how many parents and grandparents today learn about technology from their children? I mean, my daughters teach me all kinds of things that I just don't know how to do. And so, experiences and the generational position of children affords them certain kinds of understandings, certain kinds of sensitivities about difference that we have not grown up with. So in that sense, I think it's important to allow for that, to, allow for children to play that role of teaching, and there's nothing wrong with that. Of course, adult arrogance very often, takes over and, becomes an obstacle to communication with children. But increasingly, I think we're all coming to realize that that kind of dialogue that I talked to you about earlier, that intergenerational dialogue needs to happen and on more democratic terms, without this sense of arrogance that, we know and they don't, and what do you know, your children, and you don't have experiences. No, they do have experiences, and obviously we do as adults have experiences which are different and can teach children a great deal. But to foreclose the possibility of learning from children, I think, takes us way back once again, and I think it would be a mistake. So if you talk to parents, if you talk to people who are in touch with children, they will tell you how much they learn. They have to be open and admit it, but they'll tell you how much they learn from children. Talk to, mothers and fathers, and they say, oh, my children taught me this and that, because it happens. And it's amazing to open that space for reciprocal learning across the generations, I think.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for that. Thank you for all your talk and for responding to all the questions. And thank you to the audience for all your very interesting questions, follow up in this conversation. There's a closure here. I'm not sure, Christian, you're doing it or you're doing it. Okay. So thank you, everybody, for joining.
Thank you. Thank you.
So thank you to everyone who joined us today for this wonderful lecture. We also wish to invite you to continue participating in all Congress activities, forums, panels, and more. You can access the full Congress program in the Congress site at www.irscl2021.com. And see you soon. And remember to tune on Wednesday for our next keynote, Marilisa Jimenez, on the same channel at 10 a.m. Santiago times. So see you there.